Hello, and welcome to the Aquarist Podcast, your source for interviews with people from all across the tropical fish keeping hobby. I'm your host, Randy Reed. Please subscribe and check out all previous episodes on Podbean, Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes, or aquaristpodcast.com. You can also check out additional content by following the Aquarist Podcast Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts. If you like what you hear, please rate and leave a review for the show. Enjoy the interview. Good evening. Today is May 21st, 2018. I'm actually in the home of Joe Ferdenzi from the American Killifish Association. You might remember that name, and hopefully you listen to that episode. That would be episode 7. This is going to be a fairly on-the-spot kind of recording, so my plan is to really not do any editing and let you listen to just the raw cut of this talk. So Joe Ferdenzi and his wife, Anita, were wonderful enough to invite me into their home here in New York to have a lovely dinner and to tour Joe's fish room. And in Joe's fish room, not only does he have amazing tanks, wonderful killifish, he's got a Lake Tanganyika tank, he's got a beautiful Lake Malawi tank, but he has an absolute treasure trove of aquarium, tropical fish-related books, and kind of oddities and just pieces of aquarium paraphernalia, for lack of a better word, throughout the ages. And so Joe actually does give a talk on the aquarium history, and he's kind enough that after dinner and after a couple of espressos, the proper espresso, Joe's got some time this evening to talk to me about that. So Joe, thank you very much again. And I will say this, and I'll stop talking. You are now the first guest to appear twice on the Aquarist Podcast.
Well, that's quite an honor, Randy. That's quite an honor.
It comes with no monetary prize or anything of that nature, but just know that I truly appreciate it as always. So, Joe, thank you very much again for joining me on the Aquarist Podcast.
Oh, thanks, Randy. It's a pleasure. It's great to have you over and share our mutual interest in this hobby and have a wonderful meal together. It's terrific. So, as you said, my fish room is partly also a museum of aquarium artifacts, books, magazines, all kinds of things that, for the most part, I've just picked up from years of being in the hobby and having many friends and acquaintances who have all kinds of old things that represent developments in the hobby, such as different kinds of aquariums, brass aquariums, stainless steel ones, and I just as a child, I generally had an interest in history, so that when it came to my growth in this hobby, it was just natural for me to have an interest in the history of this hobby. And I have to say that I think our hobby, the aquarium hobby, has a very unique history. I think it's different from other kinds of hobbies in the way it evolved and the way it's grown and the way it continues to evolve. Now, as with many things in America, our hobby had its origins in England, and primarily in Victorian England. At the time, you kind of have to step back to understand why this hobby became so prominent in Victorian England. First of all, you have to imagine a time when people, for entertainment, had to do things live. In other words, there were no recordings. If you wanted to hear music, you had to have someone play it for you live. So in your home, you might have a piano, and in the evenings, somebody would play the piano, and you would have music, and you would sing. You would read a newspaper, but the newspapers had no color photographs or photographs at all, for that matter. So your view of things that were happening elsewhere in the world were limited to these black and white sketches, you can imagine when people first realized that in their home they could have this 3D slice of nature in color, in living color. It was a phenomenon, and especially in Victorian England, what was going on was you had this global empire. You know, England had outposts in virtually every corner of the world, and they would send out ships because, of course, England was a maritime power. They would send out ships to do trading and exploration and other things, but they would almost always send a naturalist with the ship because they figured, hey, as long as we're spending the money to send these ships out to the far-flung corners of the world, we might as well get as much out of it as we can, which includes studying the natural world. And maybe our naturalists will discover plants or fauna that might have commercial value or might have medicinal value or whatever. So they would send out naturalists with these ships. In fact, that's what Darwin was when he went on his trip on the HMS Beagle. He was a young man who they put on the ship as a naturalist, but that wasn't the main mission of the HMS Beagle. Was not to its main mission was not to study nature. That was just an ancillary thing they did. But the reports of these naturalists, you know, they would preserve, you know, they would capture and kill animals and then preserve their skins. They would make drawings of them. They would preserve the skeletons, and then they would be shipped back to England. So you can imagine in this era, they were discovering all these exotic animals, all these exotic plants from all over the world, and this craze developed in Victorian England for natural history. They would flock to botanical gardens. They would flock to public aquariums and zoos and museums with all these skulls and skins in them, because again, this was the only way to see the thing in color in 3 dimensions. Okay, so as an outgrowth of that, people became interested in keeping at first things like ferns and other exotic plants in cases made out of glass. And then somebody figured out, hey, if we make these glass cases watertight, we can keep aquatic plants and organisms in them. And this began the aquarium craze in Victorian England. And, you know, it reached such a popularity that, of course, then people had to start writing books about it because people wanted to learn how to keep an aquarium. And so people who had a little more expertise in this would start to write books. And the first aquarium book in English was published in 1854. So that's how far back the origins of our hobby in America go. They go back to 1854 in England.
And what is the name of that book if anybody wanted to try to do some eBay or garage sale explorations to try to find this treasure trove, I would imagine, if it's somehow available?
It's got a very exotic title. It's called The Aquarium by a guy named Gosse, Gosse.
Hey, when you're the first in the game, I guess you can right. Take the good names.
That's right. So I forgot his first name off the top of my head right now, but his last name was Gosse. I think his first name was Philip, but I'm not 100% sure. But his last name was definitely Gosse, Gosse. Anyway, he publishes his book in 1854. It sells very well, so he publishes a second edition in 1856. But by then, that same interest in aquariums had traveled across the Atlantic to the United States. And in 1857, the first 2 aquarium books are published in America. They're published in the same year, 1857. One of them was called The Family Aquarium. And right now, off the top of my head, I forgot what the other one was called. But you can see that the craze for aquariums traveled over the Atlantic pretty quickly because the first English book is published in 1854 and the first American books are published in 1857, only 3 years apart. And one of the people who really promoted aquariums in the early days was none other than the famous P.T. Barnum, the sucker is born, every minute guy. And so he opened a public aquarium on Broadway in Manhattan. It was public in the sense that any member of the public could go and see the exhibits, although, of course, you had to pay an admission fee. P.T. Barnum wasn't doing this as a charity,
And listeners, if you don't know who P.T. Barnum is, not going to shame you, but Google it. Google
Right.
P.T. Barnum.
Yeah,
You probably know who he is or what he's famous for.
Well, he was a legendary showman and huckster, or whatever you want to call him. So he opens his public aquarium, and then the first public not-for-profit aquarium is opened in Manhattan as well in I forget when, exactly what year, but it was, I don't know, 1870s, I want to say. I'm not 100% sure. But it was opened in an old fort at the bottom of Manhattan in Battery Park. It was a round building, and they set up the first not-for-profit public aquarium there, and then the craze spread to other cities and so forth. But in the beginning, New York City was really a hub for the development of the aquarium hobby, and you see this, that by like 1900, 1910, there's all these stores and people making tanks and selling goldfish and whatever they had, rudimentary things they had in those days, ceramic ornaments and plants and things like that.
Joe, I have a question for you. So, even going back to the Victorian age, I'm very curious to know, and maybe it's different in each of the kind of decades or the ages, but how accessible was a home aquarium to the masses, right? From a price point, because I guess when I think of Victorian age, when I think of them having some of the first home aquaria, that almost rings of or smells to me of conspicuous consumption.
Right. Well, that's it. No, that's an excellent question. In fact, the hobby, even in America, was for middle class people. First of all, yes, the tanks were not cheap. You could get glass bowls, relatively inexpensive, but as we all know, bowls have a limited capacity for holding fish. And you had to have time to take care of the aquarium. It was a leisure thing. And yes, it was a middle class thing for sure. And here's the other part of it that your question leads to. In the early days of the hobby, especially in England, most aquarium keepers were women because, of course, they were the ones who took care of the house. And aquariums were considered home adornments. So it's kind of counterintuitive to what we know the hobby to be today, where it's dominated by men. But in the early days of the hobby, it was women who played a leading role.
And nowadays, the women actually frown upon the aquariums when we put them up. The last thing that they would consider it to be would be home adornment, right?
And here's the other thing that's counterintuitive about the early days of the hobby. Nowadays, freshwater aquariums are much more prevalent than marine aquariums. But in the early days of the hobby, marine aquariums were more prevalent. And this makes sense when you think about the time. If you're in England, you're on an island, you're surrounded by seawater. You could go down to any local beach, and people in Victorian England, the middle class, used to do this by the score. They would, on Saturdays and Sundays, or mostly Sundays, they would go down to the beaches and collect their own specimens for their aquarium. Because you could go into tidal pools and collect starfish and crabs and different kinds of invertebrates. And at one time, most home aquariums had more invertebrates than fish because the invertebrates were easier to catch. Do
you think so in London they have the main river that runs through London, isn't the River Thames?
Yeah.
So
right.
in Victorian ages, was it heavily as polluted as I think it was in that time period?
It probably was very polluted. But here's the other thing. Freshwater fish in England are, for the most part, kind of large and or boring looking, okay? So freshwater aquariums were not that popular. I mean, if you think about it, if you're going to have an aquarium and you're keeping, let's say, I don't know what fish are from England, a tench, let's say. It's basically a silvery fish. You know, it looks like a sardine. Now compare that to a colorful starfish or anemone that you can collect in your tidal rock pools. They're far more colorful and interesting looking than your silvery, freshwater fish. So there wasn't a lot of that going on as much as there were collecting from the seashore. So yes, in the early days of the hobby, on both sides of the Atlantic, it was a middle-class hobby. You had to have some spare change in order to buy the aquarium and or the fish, and then you had to have the spare time. A working class person, including the wife of a working class household, they just didn't have the leisure time. They didn't have servants, so they didn't have the leisure time for an aquarium the way a middle class person who, in those days, even a middle class family might have a maid or something. Servants were much more common in those days. So yeah, it was definitely something that appealed to middle class and upper class people. Then the hobby really took off in the 30s, in the late 20s and 30s, because then what was happening was different aquarium companies, and primarily in places like Germany, they were sending people out specifically to collect exotic freshwater aquarium fishes from places like Africa and South America. And once these exotic freshwater fishes became available, and their beauty and their exoticness really catapulted the hobby forward. And also aquarium tanks began to be made on a much more commercial scale, so they were a little cheaper and everything. And the 30s in America were definitely a heyday for this hobby. I mean, you have to read the literature, the newspapers, the books of the time to understand just how popular our hobby was in the decade of the 30s. Just a couple of examples to illustrate this. Probably the most famous aquarium book that's ever been published in the United States is the famous William T. Innes book called Exotic Aquarium Fishes. This book went through 19 editions. Anyway, but the first edition of it was published in May of 1935. And prior to that, in January of 1932, Innes started publishing his famous magazine, The Aquarium. So all of this happened in the 30s. And, for example, when he started publishing The Aquarium magazine in 1932, he did something that was revolutionary at the time and helped make this magazine so popular. On the front cover of every month's issue, there was a color illustration, some would call it a photograph, of an aquarium fish. Now, the rest of the inside of the magazine was all black and white photography or black and white drawings, but the cover had a color photo. And now we're so inundated with media, that we don't appreciate the fact that back in 1932, a color photo of an aquarium fish was unheard of. It was revolutionary. So, people just wanted to buy the magazine, if for nothing else, just for the color cover with a photo of an aquarium fish. And when he published Exotic Aquarium Fishes in 1935, he illustrated the book with these color photos, which no book prior to that had ever done. And, so all of this helped introduce people not only to the fish, but to their magnificent colors, which is, after all, one of the main reasons people keep aquarium fishes. Yes, I mean, some people like to keep an aquarium fish because it's odd looking or has odd behavior or interesting breeding habits. But the vast majority of people gravitate towards tropical fish because of their amazing colors. And of course, you can't appreciate amazing colors unless you see a color photograph of the animal, So, the hobby was so popular. There were like weekly newspaper columns about the aquarium hobby in the leading newspapers of the day all over the United States.
I think that's something right there that, for me, being a Seattle native, if I were to open up my daily issue of the Seattle Times and to find somewhere in that newspaper, and not as like a special insert, but actually a regularly featured column about something in the aquarium hobby. I mean, if as an aquarist, if you can just kind of transport yourself into how cool that would be, I mean, that obviously we've come away since then, but that's really cool to hear.
Sure. And absolutely. And people, at high stations, in life, like medical doctors, all kinds of professionals, not only kept aquarium fish, they wrote about them. They would write books about them. So it was popular not only with middle-class people, but it was very popular with rich people. In fact, it was so popular that in 1934, one of America's foremost fiction writers, a guy named S.S. Van Dyne, he created this fictional detective known as Philo Vance. And he wrote a series of books starring this fictional detective named Philo Vance. And each one of these novels was a bestseller. Each one of these novels was made into a Hollywood movie. Well, this guy, S.S. Van Dyne, whose real name was Willard Huntington Wright, he kept fish. He and his wife kept aquariums. They had like 40 aquariums in their duplex apartment on Central Park West. Okay, obviously he had become very wealthy from the sale of his books. Now, in one of his Philo Vance stories that was published in 1934, called The Dragon Murder Case, one of the main characters in this book is a millionaire who has a huge estate in Upper Manhattan, and this guy has a fish room. That's his hobby. He breeds fish, and it parallels what the writer and his wife were doing, which was breeding fish. They were actually members of the New York Aquarium Society, which met at the Museum of Natural History on Central Park West, which is probably not too far from where they lived. And this book was made into a Hollywood movie in the same year. And if you were to ever get a copy of this movie called The Dragon Murder Case, you would see scenes involving aquariums, including a scene in which three of the characters are watching two male Siamese fighting fish fighting each other, okay? Which kind of parallels the plot of the story, which involves a deadly love triangle.
Spoiler alert. Uh-oh. Although if you haven't seen a movie from then by now, I guess...
Don't worry, I'm not going to give it away. But that, the plot, it centers around a love triangle, which is made obvious in the book, and everything, and in the movie. But another example of how popular the hobby was in the 30s in the public consciousness. In 1934, they made a movie called Imitation of Life, which was based on a best-selling novel from a few years earlier. And this movie starred Claudette Colbert, who was, top of the list of Hollywood stars, and a guy named Warren William, who was also a very popular actor in his day. Anyway, in this movie, Warren William, who plays the male love interest in the movie, what's his profession? He's an ichthyologist, okay? And in one of the scenes, you see him in his fish room. His fish room. He's standing next to fish tanks, okay? And the reason this has any significance, just to show you, they remade this movie, this Imitation of Life, in 1959, starring, this time, Lana Turner. And the male love interest, he wasn't an ichthyologist anymore, because by 1959, it wasn't as popular as it was in the 30s. So the love interest in the 1959 version, what does he do for a living? He's not an ichthyologist anymore. He's a photographer. So the hobby really took off in the 30s. All the magazines, all the books that came out in the 30s, a prodigious amount of literature. It was in magazines would feature it in their Sunday issue or on the cover of a magazine. It was just wildly popular.
And I'm trying to actually draw a comparison to what the aquarium hobby in the 30s would be most comparable to in modern standards in today's time, and I can't think of anything that maybe as Americans, I guess, my frame of reference, that we hold in the same manner that they did aquariums in the 30s, where it kind of spanned all walks of life, and it was this kind of binding thing in the family household.
It's hard to make a comparison. I don't know.
Our love obsession and discussion of Netflix and binge-worthy shows, I don't know.
We've become more enamored of virtual reality, whereas an aquarium is reality, And that was the difference, of course, back then. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have television, they didn't have any of the things that we have nowadays that we're so used to, where, we get to see virtual reality on our television screen, on our iPad screen, on our phone screens. Back then they didn't have that. You could see color photographs in these magazines and books that I just mentioned, but of course it was nothing like seeing a real aquarium. And that's a good point. I don't really know what we could compare it to today, but back then, I assure you, if you look at any of the popular literature, and I'm not just talking about aquarium books and aquarium periodicals, I'm talking about general literature. For example, in March of 1931, National Geographic published an issue of their magazine, and we all know, even to this day, National Geographic is one of our leading magazines, and it certainly was back in the 30s. Anyway, in this March 1931 issue, they had 2 articles out of like 7, 2 articles about the hobby. I'm not talking about tropical fish. They were about our hobby. It's full of fantastic black and white photos of aquarium society people, meetings, pet shops, accoutrements for the aquarium. I mean, that's how popular it was that a big national magazine like National Geographic would actually publish an issue with 2 articles about the hobby in it. And then, of course, the war came along, World War II, and everything slowed down. I mean, companies that were making aquariums out of metal had to shift the production because the metal was needed for other things. I know from reading things and from talking to people that were alive in that time period, they used to have metal drives where people would bring metal objects that they were discarding, and they would get recycled into things that were needed for the war effort. And that is how a lot of our antique aquariums disappeared. Not the really expensive ones, because nobody would throw those away, but the less expensive, smaller aquariums that were made out of metals, they were donated to these drives and destroyed and recycled. So that's part of the reason why some of these aquariums from the 30s are not that easy to find, because you would think they would be since it was such a popular hobby. But that's what happened during World War II. And then after the war was over, the hobby started to pick up again. And the 50s were another golden era for the hobby, where companies, now that the war was over, could go back to manufacturing things, and they started manufacturing much more sophisticated aquariums, primarily stainless steel. Stainless steel became very big after the war was over, because there was all this availability of people being able to manufacture things out of stainless steel. And then they started making the first really good air pumps. They started making filters. First they were made out of glass and metal. Later they started making things out of plastic. The first heaters, thermostatic heaters, started coming out in the 50s. So there were a lot of advancements in the hobby, technological ones, in the 50s that helped people keep their tropical fish nice and warm and keep the water filtered, and things that weren't available before. And again, even though by then there was television and there was more color photography, the aquarium hobby was still very, very popular, mostly on the freshwater side. But that's when, for example, in 1952, Herbert Axelrod published in September of 1952 the first issue of Tropical Fish Hobbyist, which, as we know, later became, America's leading hobby magazine. But it started in 1952. And Innes was still publishing different editions of his classic work into the 50s. But then Axelrod, his publishing company, started producing lots of aquarium books, which helped popularize the hobby. Back in those days, department stores had pet sections. Not like nowadays when you go into a department store, there's no pet sections. Back then, the leading department stores in every city had a pet department. And a lot of these departments, of course, featured tropical fish. So that helped spur interest in it, because you'd walk into a department store, especially if you were a kid, and you'd bug your mother to get you a fish in a tank and, etc., because it was right there in front of you in the department store. Aquarium societies started to proliferate in the 1950s, and they would hold shows and promote the hobby that way, just as they did in the 30s. In the 30s, they would have a lot of big-time tropical fish shows. And the 50s, it was the same thing. And
these fish shows, so you've got some pictures around your fish room of the fish shows from the 30s, and from times much farther back in time than in present. So one of the things that I instantly noticed is everybody there is dressed in their better than their Sunday best, right? I mean, the gentlemen, the ladies that are in these pictures, I mean, they are...
Yeah, they're dressed...
They're dressed to impress. I mean,
they're dressed in suits and ties. But
that
was commonplace back then, that, if you look at, for example, a photograph of people attending a baseball game in the 1930s, they're all wearing jackets and ties and hats, but they're all wearing jackets and ties. People didn't dress as informally, in public anyway, they didn't dress as informally as they do now.
They weren't wearing yoga pants.
No, no T-shirts, no. But, so the 50s was, I consider that another golden era for our hobby.
But the fish, and I'm sorry, Joe, but these fish club events, though, they were a big deal, though, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, it was
people took them seriously. The competitions, who would get first place, and they were serious competitions back then. People really prized their ability to show beautiful fish, and people would turn out for these things again because you couldn't go on the internet and look at fish pictures ad nauseum. Even with the books they had, there was still a limit to what you could observe in a book. There's nothing like seeing a fish live. I mean, our videos and things and our TV programs, they're pretty good because you can see the fish moving and everything. So it's not like a still photograph, but still, in the 50s they didn't have that. So if you wanted to see the fish moving and lifelike and everything, you had to go to a fish show. And
I mean, we're just watching your Lake Malawi tank, and I mean, it's one thing to see these labs and peacocks a full color picture. But, I mean, the photograph is not going to do it justice because of the behavior. It's almost distracting how cool they are to watch as I sit here and engage with you in this conversation. I mean, I couldn't imagine what, somebody's first experience. I mean, if we all try to think back of when that's the first time we saw African cichlids or any fish for that matter. But, to be able to see them, to not have all the YouTube videos, to go back on all of the internet pictures and only have maybe one photograph. Maybe it's even a grainy color photograph at best of a specimen, but to actually see them in person is probably was something really cool. Yeah,
and then of course what happened during the 50s was air transportation, which made it easier for fish that were collected in exotic places like South America and Africa to be transported back to Europe or the United States for distribution into the hobby. So, for example, in the 30s, they had discovered the neon tetra, which was like the star of its day, and the angelfish, which was another big star of its day. Well, in the 50s, they discovered the cardinal tetra and the discus, which were huge aquarium stars. So, you see, each epoch had these fish that people went nuts over that helped spur it. In the 50s, also, another big development was fancy guppy breeding. People, had learned how to develop that rather modest-looking little guppy from Trinidad into this amazing animal with flowing fins and solid colors. And the guppy hobby was huge in the 1950s. And this helped spur the hobby in general because guppies were colorful, easy to take care of, didn't require huge aquariums. Even a person of modest means could now have a small aquarium with colorful little fish that would breed for you, because we know guppies, that's what they do.
What do we know of, going back as far as you'd like to on this question, of the home success rate of keeping fish? I mean, you can go on any forum and any Facebook page today and see the struggles that some people have with keeping fish, keeping them healthy, ick, dropsy, the bloat, all of the various issues. And we are at the cutting edge of aquarium technology, right? In the present time is when we're most cutting. I can go and buy a Fluval FX6, which is one of the most cutting edge canister filters ever made. We've got LED lights up the wazoo. We have all of this amazing technology, especially when it's put in comparison to what you see of 10, 20 years back. And especially if we go back to the 30s and 50s, like I see some of the equipment that you have here that is, display antique equipment. But the survival rates, so do we have any sense of, the home aquarist's ability to keep these species alive? I mean, it seems like for the hobby to continue to grow, like, they're not just buying fish every week because they're dying, right? Like, there's some level...
Yeah, no, I mean, they had... I mean, first of all, the stock back then of certain fish was very good because they were coming from the wild, so the genetic makeup was very good. Or another thing that started happening was a lot of Florida fish farms. And back then, the Florida fish were very healthy and everything. So with certain fish, I think there was a lot of success primarily with things like live bearers, platies, guppies, swordtails, things like that. Maybe some other fish, people weren't as successful with them, but because when you read the magazines, you see they would have question and answer columns, and also you would see what people would write about in their columns, and yes, I mean, just like today, there are people who don't have success with keeping fish, usually because they don't follow basic rules and principles, and that's why they get into trouble. Granted that there are some fish that are so difficult to keep that even experienced people have difficulty with them. But there were also a lot of successes back in the 50s. You know, I mean, one of my very dear friends is a gentleman named Rosario LaCourte, who's from New Jersey, and he began breeding a lot of fish in the 1950s, and he's still breeding fish to this day. He's almost 90, and he bred a lot of barbs and tetras and killifish and whatever anybody gave him. He was able to breed it successfully, and we're talking about the 1950s, because he was good at what he did. He fed his fish correctly. A lot of live food, a lot of good food, a lot of water changes. He would pay attention. He would pick up on things that an average person might not pick up on in terms of the behavior of the fish, or what they like to eat, or what kind of water conditions they like. So there were many, many successful aquarists in the 50s, and of course their breeding successes help promote the hobby as well, because then if they bred a fish and made it available, then other people could acquire them. And like I said, and then the other thing was the air transportation. The more pet shops were opening up because it was easier to get fish to sell. So, yeah, people had the same kind of difficulties they have today. Fish would get sick. They didn't know as much as we know now. So curing fish back in the 50s was a hit or miss kind of thing compared to today, when we know so much more about pathogens and antibiotics and things of that sort. But, you know, look, in my own fish room, once in a while, and this happens mostly with some of the annual killifish, I'll get some outbreak of velvet, which is a parasitic thing similar to ick, and then I'll break out my go-to remedy, which is good old-fashioned malachite green. But other than that, I rarely have a need for medicines, because if you do certain basic things, you're not going to have a lot of sick fish. And these aquarists from the 50s who were successful at breeding fish, they followed these basic rules, which is don't overcrowd your fish, feed them good food, do water changes, and 90% of the time your fish will be fine if you follow those basic rules. So
it may be kind of an anti-marketing campaign for some of the manufacturers out there, but if they could do fish keeping and fish breeding well back then without the fancy technology that we have today, that should kind of tell us that we shouldn't necessarily have to rush out to buy the newest, sexiest piece of equipment. Just follow the basics, do your water changes.
Right, you could. Although let me say this about all that stuff. It's good. I mean, it helps you be more successful. I mean, if you have good filters and you can make little mistakes and it won't be fatal, it gives you a margin for error. So I use a lot of old-fashioned box filters, but as you can tell from looking at my aquariums, they all have some sort of filtration, whether it's modest or like a box filter, or it's more high-tech like a canister filter. I do believe in that. I do believe it makes for a healthier aquarium and gives you a margin for error. So I do believe in it, and I do believe that manufacturers of aquarium equipment have come a long way. I mean, once upon a time, if you had a power filter, it was like running a refrigerator. It used that much power. Nowadays, I'm happy to see that most of the equipment is very energy efficient. The filters, the power filters use very little wattage. We are converting most of our lighting to LED lighting, which is very energy efficient. I mean, back in the 50s, they had the most prevalent kind of lighting was incandescent lighting. They had fluorescent lighting, but it was very expensive, so very few people could afford that.
I'm going to make a bad joke. In the Victorian era, did they ever do par meter testings on the whale blubber lighting that they would use?
Yeah, whale blubber.
It's 10:30 at night here, so I'm allowed a few bad jokes.
Yeah. So, no, I think all this modern equipment we have is terrific, and I actually, encourage you to use it. I mean, without lighting, you can't raise aquarium plants, and I love aquarium plants. So I'm so happy about, having the ability to convert a lot of my lights over to LEDs because they're so energy efficient and they don't produce heat. That's another thing. Why would you want to heat up your fish room more than necessary, or your tanks? And the filters, like I said, nowadays they're terrific because they use so little energy. I mean, I've got filters around here that use like 3 or 4 watts. It's amazing compared to the old filters. Yeah. So no. I mean, the technology thing I think is fantastic. Yes, it's true. You can keep an aquarium without fancy equipment, absolutely, but then you've got to stay on top of it. You can't let the water changes go. You really got to make sure your tank's not overcrowded, that kind of stuff. So, but, yeah, so, and I think the hobby started to trail off a little bit in the 80s. I mean, it was still very popular when I got started, which was in the mid-'60s. A lot of kids my age had aquariums. Me and my friends, we would walk to aquarium stores. We would take the subway to aquarium stores. It was just a very popular hobby. And we were always fascinated by, what fish we'd find in the store or whatever. And, again, there were more products available. They started importing things from overseas, like Germany, like Tetramin was introduced in the 60s, which became a very popular food because up until then, almost no one had ever heard of flake food until that came along. And so the availability of all these different products, and of course, the more popular it was, the more the prices got reduced for both fish and equipment and tanks and food and everything. So that made it so that even a person of modest means could have aquariums and keep tropical fish. And that's another thing I like about the aquarium hobby. I find it to be very sort of egalitarian. People at all different levels of economic success can have aquariums and be just as successful as anybody else. You don't need to be rich to be a successful aquarist. That's for sure. Aquarium societies have always played an important role in the development of our hobby, whether it's from having shows, publishing magazines, which aquarium societies have always done, or like the San Francisco Aquarium Society. They're the first ones that developed and marketed brine shrimp.
Which you have a can.
Yes, I have one of their original cans from the 1940s, and it says, distributed by the San Francisco Aquarium Society. And we know, as hobbyists, if you're breeding fish, the ability to hatch brine shrimp cysts is extremely important in breeding, especially killifish people. We live by that thing. I don't know what we would do if we couldn't hatch out brine shrimp, for our fry, especially for annual killifish. So aquarium societies have always played a very large role in the aquarium, the development of the aquarium hobby, and anybody nowadays who belongs to an aquarium society is pushing that history forward. I still think, even in spite of all the media we have today, all the websites, all the YouTube videos and everything. I still think it's very important to belong to an aquarium society, to make personal contact with people. This is how I get a lot of my fish, is from other people in the hobby who are kind enough to share their fish with me. And I try to do the same. When I have breeding successes, I try to share my stuff with other people in the hobby. And we're keeping the history of this hobby alive, whether you realize it or not. If you are a member of an aquarium society, or you make a YouTube video, or you're doing what Randy's doing, you're keeping the history of this hobby going forward. And hopefully it's a hobby that will always be around. I think it will be. I do think so. It may not be as popular as it was in the 30s or the 50s, but I think in spite of all the distractions we have today from virtual reality, there's something about an aquarium that is never going to lose its appeal for a certain group of people. It's great to be part of it.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole conversation on just the fundamental reasons of why we keep fish in aquariums, but I don't know how you could argue with somebody with having, again, this Malawi tank that I've been looking at this whole time we've been talking. I mean, it's absolutely captivating. And when you go in people's homes and they have a fish tank within view, it's so hard not to look at that and just spend some time really appreciating the fish in it. And for my part, I don't know how impactful I can be, but I want people to join their local fish clubs. I want to get more people in this hobby. I want people to partake and enjoy in keeping fish. And, if they choose to breed, if they choose to share, choose to sell for profit, whatever. But just enjoying the fish as they are is such a fun experience.
Yeah. See, now that you mention it, that is a pretty nice tank. I must say, yeah. I don't know if I get a chance to just sit here and stare at it, because as you can tell, with 60 aquariums, there's always a lot of work to do. But I enjoy it. I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. Joe, you have been fantastic again. You've opened up your house and your hospitality to me. You've opened up your fish room and just all the excellent memorabilia that you have. And so I'm forever indebted to you. And hopefully, I might be able to convince some people. Maybe we'll fly out to Seattle and have you speak at the GSAS sometime. I think that would be awesome. I think we're looking to fill our 2019 calendar, so I am a chairperson now. You didn't hear that?
No.
I'm the chair of the CARES program.
Oh my God.
Well,
it's great.
On up.
Randy, it's been great to have you over.
Joe, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Everyone, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. All right, you take care now.
Okay.
Thank you again for listening to the Aquarist Podcast. As always, get involved in your local fish club, help grow this wonderful hobby, and have fun with other fish nerds.